Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Let's get right into it with Chapter 12, in which Phileas Fogg and his companions venture across the Indian forests and what ensued. In order to shorten the journey, the guide passed to the left of the line where the railway was still in process of being built. This line, owing to the capricious tunings of the Vindhya Mountains, did not pursue a straight course. The Parsee, who was quite familiar with the roads and paths in the district, declared that they should gain 20 miles by striking directly through the forest. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, plunged to the neck in the peculiar howdahs provided for them, were terribly jostled by the swift trotting of the elephant, spurred on as he was by the skilful Parsee, but they endured the discomfort with true British phlegm, talking little and scarcely able to catch a glimpse of each other. As for Passepartout, who was mounted on the beast's back, and received the direct force of each concussion as he trod along, was very careful, in accordance with his master's advice, to keep his tongue from between his teeth, as it would otherwise have been bitten off short. The worthy fellow bounced from the elephant's neck to his rump, and vaulted like a clown on a springboard, and yet he laughed in the midst of his bouncing. And from time to time took a piece of sugar out of his pocket and inserted it in Kye&I's trunk, who received it without in the least slackening his regular trot. After 2 hours the guide stopped the elephant and gave him an hour for rest, during which Kye&I, after quenching his thirst at a neighbouring spring, set to devouring the branches and shrubs around him. Neither Sir Francis nor Mr. Fogg regretted the delay, and both descended with a feeling of relief. "Why, he's made of iron!" exclaimed the General, gazing admiringly on Kye&I. "Of forged iron," replied Passepartout as he set about preparing a hasty breakfast. At noon the Parsee gave the signal of departure. The country soon presented a very savage aspect. Copses of dates and dwarf palms succeeded the dense forest, then vast dry plains, dotted with scanty shrubs and sown with great blocks of syenite. All this portion of Budelkund, which is little frequented by travellers, is inhabited by a fanatical population, hardened in the most horrible practices of the Hindu faith. You? Gross. Racism. Anyway, the English have not been able to secure complete dominion over the territory, which is subjected to the influence of Rahas, whom it is almost impossible to reach in their inaccessible mountain fastnesses. The travellers several times saw bands of ferocious Indians, who, when they perceived the elephant striding across country, made angry and threatening motions. The Parsee avoided them as much as possible, and few animals were observed on the route. Even the monkeys hurried from their path with contortions and grimaces which convulsed Passepartout with laughter. In the midst of his gaiety, however, one thought troubled the worthy servant. What would Mr. Fogg do with the elephant when he got to Allahabad? Would he carry on with him? It was impossible. The cost of transporting him would make him ruinously expensive. Would he sell him or set him free? The estimable beast certainly deserved some consideration. Should Mr. Fogg choose to make him, Passepartout, a present of Kye&I, he'd be very much embarrassed, and these thoughts did not cease worrying him for a long time. The principal chain of the Vindhyas was crossed by 8 in the evening, and another halt was made on the northern slope in a ruined bungalow. They had gone nearly 25 miles that day, and an equal distance still separated them from the station of Allahabad. The night was cold, and the Parsee lit a fire in the bungalow with a few dry branches, and the warmth was very grateful. Provisions purchased at Colby sufficed for supper, and the travellers ate ravenously. The conversation, beginning with a few disconnected phrases, soon gave place to loud and steady snores. The guide watched Kye&I, who slept standing, bolstering himself against the trunk of a large tree. Nothing occurred during the night to disturb the slumberers, although occasional growls from panthers and chatterings of monkeys broke the silence. The more formidable beasts made no cries or hostile demonstration against the occupants of the bungalow. Sir Francis slept heavily, like an honest soldier overcome with fatigue. Passepartout was wrapped in uneasy dreams of the bouncing of the day before, and as for Mr. Fogg, he slumbered as peacefully as if he had been in his serene mansion in Savile Row. The journey was resumed at 6 in the morning. The guide hoped to reach Allahabad by evening. In that case, Mr. Fogg would only lose a part of the 48 hours saved since the beginning of the tour. Kye&I, resuming his rapid gait, soon descended the lower spurs of the Vindhyas, and towards noon they passed by the village of Callinger, on the Kye, one of the branches of the Ganges. The guide avoided inhabited places, thinking it safer to keep the open country which lies upon the first depressions of the basin of the great river. Allahabad was now only 12 miles to the northeast. They stopped under a clump of bananas, the fruit of which, as healthy as bread and as succulent as cream, was amply partaken of and appreciated. At 2 o'clock, the guide entered a thick forest which extended several miles. He preferred to travel under cover of the woods. They had not, as of yet, had any unpleasant encounters, and the journey seemed on the point of being successfully accomplished, when the elephant, becoming restless, suddenly stopped. It was then 4 o'clock. "What's the matter?" said Sir Francis, putting out his head. "I don't know, officer," replied the Parsee, listening attentively to a confused murmur which came through the thick branches. Oh dear, I love when I lose my place and then space out. It's my favorite. Anyway, the murmur soon became more distinct. It now seemed like a distant concert of human voices, accompanied by brass instruments. Passepartout was all eyes and ears. Mr. Fogg patiently waited without a word, and the Parsee jumped to the ground, fastened the elephant to a tree, and plunged into the thicket. He soon returned, saying, "A procession of Brahmins is coming this way. We must prevent their seeing us, if possible." The guide unloosed the elephant and led him into a thicket, at the same time asking the travelers not to stir. He held himself ready to bestride the animal at a moment's notice, should flight become necessary, but evidently he thought that the procession of the faithful would pass without perceiving them amid the thick foliage in which they were wholly concealed. The discordant tones of the voices and instruments drew nearer, and now droning songs mingled with the sound of tambourines and cymbals. The head of the procession soon appeared beneath the trees 100 paces away, and the strange figures who performed the religious ceremony were easily distinguished through the branches. First came the priests with mitres on their heads, and clothed in long lace robes. They were surrounded by men, women, and children, who sang a kind of lugubrious psalm, interrupted at regular intervals by the tambourine and cymbals, while behind them was drawn a car with large wheels, the spokes of which represented serpents intertwined with each other. Upon the car, which was drawn by 4 richly caparisoned. Hello? I've never seen that word before. Caparisoned. Caparisoned? Maybe? I don't think the inbuilt dictionary knows what it is. Carapacin, an ornamental covering spread over a horse's saddle or harness. Okay. Which was drawn by 4 richly decorated zebus, stood a hideous statue with 4 arms, the body colored a dull red, with haggard eyes, disheveled hair, protruding tongue, and lips tinted with betel. It stood upright upon the figure of a prostrate and headless giant. Sir Francis, recognizing the statue, whispered, "The goddess Kali, the goddess of love and death." "Of death, perhaps, but of love that ugly old hag never," muttered back Passepartout. The Parsee made a motion to keep quiet. A group of old fakirs were capering and making a wild ado round the statue. These were striped with ochre and covered with cuts whence their blood issued drop by drop. Fanatics who in their great ceremonies still throw themselves under the wheels of the juggernaut. Some Brahmins, clad in all the sumptuousness of oriental apparel, and leading a woman who faltered at every step, followed. This woman was young and fair as the average European. Her head and neck, shoulders, ears, arms, hands, and toes were loaded down with jewels and gems, with bracelets, earrings, and rings, while a tunic bordered with gold and covered with a light muslin robe betrayed the outline of her form. The guards who followed the young woman presented a violent contrast to her, armed as they were with sabres hung at their waists, and long damascened pistols and bearing a corpse on a palanquin. It was the body of an old man, gorgeously arrayed in the habiliments of a Raja, wearing in life a turban embroidered with pearls, a robe of tissue of silk and gold, a scarf of cashmere sewed with diamonds, and the magnificent weapons of a Hindu prince. Next came the musicians in a rearguard of capering fakirs, whose cries sometimes drowned the noise of the instruments. These closed the procession. Sir Francis watched the procession with a sad countenance, and, turning to the guide, said, "A settee." The Parsee nodded and put his finger up to his lips again. The procession slowly wound under the trees, and soon its last ranks disappeared in the depths of the wood. The songs gradually died away, and occasionally cries were heard in the distance, until at last all was silence again. Phileas Fogg had heard what Sir Francis said, and as soon as the procession had disappeared, asked, "What's a suttee?" "A suttee," returned the general, "is a human sacrifice, but a voluntary one. The women you have just seen will be burned tomorrow at the dawn of the day." "Oh, the scoundrels!" cried Passepartout, who couldn't repress his indignation. "And the corpse?" "Is that of the prince, her... Oh, hang on, this is the guide. "Is that of the prince, her husband, an independent Raja, the Bilkund." "It is possible," resumed Phileas, his voice not betraying the least emotion, "that these customs still exist in India, and that the English have been unable to put a stop to them." "These sacrifices do not occur in the larger portion of India," replied Sir Francis. "But we have no power over these savage territories, especially here in Bilkund. The whole district north of the Vindhyas is the theatre of incessant murders and pillage." "The poor wretch to be burned alive." "Yes, burned alive, and if she were not, you cannot conceive what treatment she'd be obliged to submit to from her relatives. They'd shave off her hair, feed her on a scant allowance of rice, treat her with contempt. She'd be looked upon as an unclean creature, and would die in some corner like a scurvy dog. And the prospect of so frightful an existence drives these poor creatures to the sacrifice much more than love or religious fanaticism. Sometimes, however, the sacrifice really is voluntary, and it requires the active interference of the government to prevent it. Several years ago, when I was living at Bombay, a young widow asked permission of the governor to be burned along with her husband's body, but as you may imagine, he refused. The woman left the town, took refuge with an independent Raja, and then carried out her self-devoted purpose. While Sir Francis was speaking, the guide shook his head several times and said, The sacrifice which will take place tomorrow at dawn is not a voluntary one." "How do you know?" "Everybody knows about this affair in Bilkund." "But the wretched creature didn't seem to be making any resistance." "That was because they'd intoxicated her with fumes of hemp and opium." "But where are they taking her?" "To the pagoda of Pilarji, 2 miles from here. She will pass the night there." "And the sacrifice will take place
tomorrow at the light of dawn."
The guide now led the elephant out of the thicket and leapt upon his neck. Just at the moment that he was about to urge Kye&I forward with a peculiar whistle, Mr. Fogg stopped him, and, turning to Sir Francis, said, "Suppose we save this woman?"
"I have yet 12 hours to spare. I can... Save the woman, Mr. Fogg."
"I have 12 hours yet to spare. I can devote them to that."
"You're a man of heart."
"Sometimes, when I have the time." Chapter 13, in which Passepartout receives a new proof that fortune favors the brave. The project was a bold one, full of difficulty, perhaps impracticable. Mr. Fogg was going to risk life, or at least his liberty, and therefore the success of his tour, but he didn't hesitate, and he found in Sir Francis Cromarty an enthusiastic ally. As for Passepartout, he was ready for anything that might be proposed. His master's idea charmed him. He perceived a heart, a soul under that icy exterior, and he began to love Phileas Fogg. There remained the guide. What course would he adopt? Would he not take part with the Indians? In the default of his assistance, it was necessary to be assured of his neutrality. Sir Francis frankly put the question to him.
Officers, I am a Parsee, and this woman is a Parsee. Command me as you will.
Excellent.
However, it is certain not only that we should risk our lives, but horrible tortures if we are taken.
That is foreseen. I think we must wait until night before acting.
I think so.
The guide then gave some account of the victim, who he said was a celebrated beauty of the Parsee race, and the daughter of a wealthy Bombay merchant. She had received a thoroughly English education in that city, and from her manners and intelligence would be thought a European. Her name was Aouda. Left an orphan, she was married against her will to the old Raja of Budukund, and knowing the fate that awaited her, she escaped, was retaken, and devoted by the Raja's relatives, who had an interest in her death, to the sacrifice from which it seemed she couldn't escape. The Parsee's narrative only confirmed Mr. Fogg and his companions in their generous design. It was decided that the guide should direct the elephant towards the pagoda of Pilyaj, which he accordingly approached as quickly as possible. They halted half an hour afterwards in a copse, some 500 feet from the pagoda, where they were well concealed, but they could hear the groans and cries of the fakirs distinctly. They then discussed the means of getting at the victim. The guide was familiar with the pagoda of Pilyaj, in which he declared the young woman was imprisoned. Could they enter any of its doors while the whole party was plunged in a drunken sleep, or was it safer to attempt to make a hole in the wall? This could only be determined at the moment and the place themselves, but it was certain that the abduction must be made that night, and not when, at the break of day, the victim was led to her funeral pyre. There was no human intervention able to save her after that. As soon as night fell, around 6 o'clock, they decided to make a reconnaissance around the pagoda. The cries of the fakirs were just ceasing. They were in the act of plunging themselves into drunkenness caused by opium mingled with hemp, and it might be possible to slip between them to the temple itself. The Parsee, leading the others, noiselessly crept through the wood, and in 10 minutes they found themselves on the banks of a small stream, whence, by the light of the rosin torches, they perceived a pyre of wood, on top of it which lay the embalmed body of the Raja, which was to be burned with his wife. The pagoda, whose minarets loomed above the trees in deepening dusk, stood 100 steps away. "Come now," whispered the guide, and he slipped more cautiously than ever through the brush, followed by his companions. The silence around was only broken by the low murmuring of the wind among the branches. Soon the Parsee stopped on the borders of the glade, which was lit up by the torches. The ground was covered by groups of Indians, motionless in their drunken sleep. It seemed a battlefield strewn with dead. Men, women, and children lay together. In the background, among the trees, the pagoda of Pilyaj loomed distinctly. Much to the guide's disappointment, the guards of the Raja, lit by torches, were watching at the doors and marching to and fro with their exposed sabers. Probably the priests, too, were watching within. The Parsee, now convinced it was impossible to force an entrance to the temple, advanced no farther, but led his companions back again. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty also saw that nothing could be attempted in that direction. They stopped and engaged in a whispered colloquy.
"It's only 8 now, and these guards may go to sleep." "It's not impossible."
They lay down at the foot of a tree and waited. The time seemed long. The guide ever and anon left them to take an observation on the edge of the wood, but the guards watched steadily by the gaze of the torches, and a dim light crept through the windows of the pagoda. They waited until midnight, but no change took place among the guards, and it became apparent that their yielding to sleep could not be counted on. The other plan must be carried out. An opening in the walls of the pagoda must be made. It remained to ascertain whether the priests were watching by their side of the victim as assiduously as the soldiers were at the door. After a last consultation, the guide announced that he was ready for the attempt, and advanced, followed by the others. They took a roundabout way, so as to get at the pagoda on the rear. They reached the walls about 12:30 without having met anyone, and here there was no guard, nor were there any windows nor doors. The night was dark, and the moon, on the wane scarcely left the horizon, and was covered with heavy clouds, the height of the trees deepening the darkness. It wasn't enough to reach the walls. An opening in them must be accomplished, and to attain this purpose the party only had their pocket knives. Happily the temple walls were built of brick and wood, which could be penetrated with little difficulty. After one brick had been taken out, the rest would yield easily. They set noiselessly to work, and the Parsee on one side and Passepartout on the other began to loosen the bricks so as to make an aperture 2 feet wide. They were getting on rapidly, when suddenly a cry was heard in the interior of the temple, followed almost instantly by other cries replying from the outside. Passepartout and the guide stopped. Had they been heard? Was the alarm being given? Common prudence urged them to retire, and they did so, followed by Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis. They again hid themselves in the wood and waited until the disturbance, whatever it might be, ceased, holding themselves ready to resume their attempt without delay. But awkwardly enough, the guards now appeared at the rear of the temple, and there installed themselves in readiness to prevent a surprise. It would be difficult to describe the disappointment of the party thus interrupted in their work. They could now not reach the victim. How then could they save her? Sir Francis shook his fists, Passepartout was beside himself, and the guide gnashed his teeth with rage. The tranquil Fogg waited without betraying any emotion. "We have nothing to do but to go away." "Nothing to do but to go away?" "Stop. I am only due at Al-Wahad tomorrow before noon." "But what can you hope to do? In a few hours it will be daylight, and the chance which now seems lost may present itself at the last moment." Sir Francis would have liked to have read Phileas Fogg's eyes. What was this cool Englishman thinking of? Was he planning to make a rush for the young woman at the very moment of the sacrifice, and boldly snatch her from her executioners? This would be utter folly. It was hard to admit that Fogg was such a fool. Sir Francis consented, however, to remain to the end of this terrible drama. The guide led them to the rear of the glade, where they were able to observe the sleeping groups. Meanwhile, Passepartout, who had perched himself on the lower branches of a tree, was resolving an idea which at first struck him like a flash, and which was now firmly lodged in his brain. He'd commenced by saying to himself, "What folly?" and then repeated, "Why not, after all? It's a chance. Perhaps the only one, and with such thoughts." Thinking thus, he slipped with the suppleness of a serpent to the lowest branches, the ends of which bent almost to the ground. The hours passed, and the lighter shades now announced the approach of day, though it was not yet light. This was the moment. The slumbering multitude became animated, the tambourines sounded, songs and cries arose. The hour of the sacrifice had come. The doors of the pagoda swung open, and a bright light escaped from its interior, in the midst of which Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis espied the victim. She seemed, having shaken off the stupor of her intoxication, to be striving to escape from her executioner. Sir Francis's heart throbbed, and, convulsively seizing Mr. Fogg's hand, found it in an open knife. Just at this moment the crowd began to move. The young woman had fallen again into a stupor caused by the fumes of hemp, and passed among the fakirs who escorted her with her wild religious cries. Phileas Fogg and his companions, mingling in the rear ranks of the crowd, followed, and in 2 minutes they reached the banks of the stream, and stopped 50 paces from the pyre, upon which still lay the Rajah's corpse. In semi-obscurity they saw this victim, quite senseless, stretched out beside her husband's body. Then a torch was brought, and the wood, heavily soaked with oil, instantly took fire. At this moment Sir Francis and the guide seized Phileas Fogg, who, in an instant of mad generosity, was about to run upon the pyre. But he had quickly pushed them aside when the whole scene suddenly changed. A cry of terror arose. The whole multitude prostrated themselves, terror-stricken, on the ground. The old Rajah was not dead, then, since he rose of a sudden like a spectre, took up his wife in his arms, and descended from the pyre in the midst of clouds of smoke, which only heightened his ghostly appearance. Fakirs and soldiers and priests, seized with instant terror, lay there with their faces on the ground, not daring to lift their eyes and behold such a prodigy. The inappropriate victim was borne along by the vigorous arms which supported her, and which she did not seem in the least to burden. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis stood erect. The Parsee bowed his head, and Passepartout was, no doubt, scarcely less stupefied. The resuscitated Raja approached Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg, and in an abrupt tone said, "Let us be off." It was Passepartout himself who had slipped upon the pyre in the midst of the smoke, and, profiting by the still overhanging darkness, had delivered the young woman from death. Then Passepartout, who, playing his part with happy audacity, had passed through the crowd amid the general terror. A moment after all four of the party had disappeared into the woods, and the elephant was bearing away at a rapid pace. But the cries and noise, and a ball which whizzed through Phileas Fogg's hat, apprised them that the trick had been discovered. The old Raja's body, indeed, now appeared upon the burning pyre, and the priests, recovered from their terror, perceived that an abduction had taken place. They hastened into the forest, followed by soldiers who fired a volley after the fugitives, but the latter rapidly increased the distance between them, and ere long found themselves beyond the reach of bullets and arrows. Chapter 14, in which Phileas Fogg descends the whole length of the beautiful valley of the Ganges without ever thinking of seeing it. The rash exploit had been accomplished, and for an hour Passepartout laughed gaily at his success. Sir Francis pressed the worthy fellow's hand, and his master said, "Well done," which from him was high commendation, to which Passepartout replied that all the credit of the affair belonged to Mr. Fogg. As for him, he had only been struck with a strange idea, and he laughed to think that for a few moments he, Passepartout, the ex-gymnast, ex-sergeant fireman, had been the spouse of a charming woman, a venerable, embalmed Raja. As for the young Indian woman, she had been unconscious throughout of what she was passing, and now, wrapped up in a travelling blanket, was reposing in one of the howdahs. The elephant, thanks to the skilful guidance of the Parsee, was advancing rapidly through the still darksome forest, and an hour after leaving the pagoda had crossed a vast plain. They made a halt at 7 o'clock, the young woman being still in a state of complete prostration. The guide made her drink a little brandy and water, but the drowsiness which stupefied her could not yet be shaken off. Sir Francis, who was familiar with the effects of intoxication produced by the fumes of hemp, reassured his companions on her account, but he was more disturbed at the prospect of her future fate. He told Phileas Fogg that, should Aouda remain in India, she would inevitably fall again into the hands of her executioners. These fanatics were scattered throughout the country, and would, despite the English police, recover their victim in Madras, Bombay, or Calcutta. She would only be safe by quitting India forever. And Phileas Fogg replied that he would reflect upon the matter. The station at Allahabad was reached about 10 o'clock, and, the interrupted line of railway being resumed, would enable them to reach Calcutta in less than 24 hours. Fogg would thus be able to arrive in time to take the steamer, which left Calcutta the next day, October 25th, at noon, for Hong Kong. The young woman was placed in one of the waiting rooms of the station, while Passepartout was charged with purchasing for her various articles of toilet, a dress, shawl, and some furs, for which his master gave him unlimited credit. Passepartout started off forthwith, and found himself in the streets of Allahabad, that is, the city of God, one of the most venerated in India, being built at the junction of the two sacred rivers Ganges and Yamuna, the waters of which attract pilgrims from every part of the peninsula. The Ganges, according to legends of the Ramayana, rises in heaven, whence, owing to Brahma's agency, it descends to the earth. Passepartout made it a point, as he made his purchases, to take a good look at the city. It was formerly defended by a noble fort, which had since become a state prison. Its commerce had dwindled away, and Passepartout in vain looked about him for such a bazaar as he used to frequent in Regent Street. At last he came upon an elderly, crusty person who sold second-hand articles, and from whom he purchased a dress of Scotch stuff, a large mantle, and a fine otter-skin pelisse, for which he did not hesitate to pay £75. He then returned triumphantly to the station. The influence to which the priests of Pelage had subjected Iota had begun gradually to yield, and she became more herself, so that her fine eyes resumed all their soft Indian expression. When the poet king, Ukaf Udal, celebrates the charms of the queen of Amenagara, he speaks thus. Her shining tresses, divided in two parts, encircle the harmonious contour of her white and delicate cheeks, brilliant in their glow and freshness. Her ebony brows have the form and charm of the bow of Kama, the god of love, and beneath her long silken lashes the purest reflections and a celestial light swim, as in the sacred lakes of the Himalaya, in the black pupils of her great clear eyes. Her teeth, fine, equal, and white, glitter between her smiling lips like dewdrops in a passion flower's half-enveloped breast. Her delicately formed ears, her vermilion hands, her little feet, curved and tender as the lotus bud, glitter with the brilliancy of the loveless pearls of Ceylon, the most dazzling diamonds of Golconda. Her narrow and supple waist, which a hand may clasp around, sets forth the outline of her rounded figure and the beauty of her bosom, where youth in its flower displays the wealth of its treasures, and beneath the silken folds of her tunic she seems to have been modelled in pure silver by the godlike hand of Vikvarkama, the immortal sculptor. It's enough to say, without applying this poetical rhapsody Ayuda, that she was a charming woman in all the European acceptation of the phrase. She spoke English with great purity, and the guide had not been exaggerated in saying that the young Parsee had been transformed by bringing her up. The train was about to start from Albahad, and Mr. Fogg proceeded to pay the guide the price agreed upon for his service, and not a farthing more, which astonished Passepartout, who remembered all that his master owed the guide's devotion. He had indeed risked his life in the adventure at Piliash, and should he be caught afterwards by the Indians, he would so difficultly escape their vengeance. Kye&I, who also must be disposed of. What should be done with the elephant who had been so dearly purchased? Fogg had already determined the question. Parsee, you have been serviceable and devoted. I have paid for your service, but not your devotion. Would you like to have this elephant? He is yours. The guide's eyes glistened. Your honor is giving me a fortune. Take him, guide, and I shall still be your debtor. Good. Take him, friend. Kye&I is a brave and faithful beast. And going up to the elephant, Passepartout gave him several lumps of sugar, saying, Here, Kye&I, here. The elephant grunted out his satisfaction, and, clasping Passepartout around the waist with his trunk, lifted him as high as his head. Passepartout, not in the least alarmed, caressed the animal, which replaced him gently on the ground. Soon after, Phileas Fogg, Sir Francis Cromarty, and Passepartout, installed in a carriage with Aouda, who had the best seat, were whirling at full speed toward Benares. It was a run of 80 miles, and it was accomplished in 2 hours. During the journey, the young woman finally recovered to her senses. What was her astonishment was to find herself in this carriage on the railway, dressed in European habiliments, and with travellers who were quite strangers to her. Her companions first set about fully reviving her with a little liquor, and then Sir Francis narrated to her what had passed, dwelling upon the courage with which Phileas Fogg had not hesitated to risk his life to save her, and recounting the happy sequel of the venture as result of Passepartout's rash idea. Mr. Fogg said nothing, while Passepartout, abashed, kept repeating that it wasn't worth it. Iota pathetically thanked her deliverers, rather with tears than words, but her fine eyes intercepted a gratitude more than her lips. Then, as her thoughts strayed back to the scene of the sacrifice and realized the dangers which still menaced her, she shuddered with terror. Phileas Fogg understood what was passing in Aouda's mind, and offered, in order to reassure her, to escort her to Hong Kong, where she might remain safely until the affair is settled up. Sorry, I owe an offer which she eagerly and gratefully accepted. She had, it seems, a Parsi relation who was one of the principal merchants of Hong Kong, which is wholly an English city, though an island on the Chinese coast. At 12:30, the train stopped at Benares. The Brahmin legends assert that the city is built on the site of the ancient Kasi, which, like Mahomet's tomb, was once suspended between heaven and earth, though the Benares of today, which the Orientalists call the Athens of India, stands quite unpoetically on the solid earth. Passepartout caught glimpses of its brick houses and clay huts, giving an aspect of desolation to the place as the train entered it. Benares was Sir Francis Cromarty's destination, the troops he was rejoining being encamped some miles northward of the city. He bade adieu to Phileas Fogg, wishing him all success, and expressing the hope that he would come that way again in a less original but more profitable fashion. Mr. Fogg lightly pressed him by the hand, and the parting of Aouda, who did not forget that what she was owed to Sir Francis, betrayed more warmth, and as for Passepartout, he received a hearty shake of the hand from the gallant general. The railway, on leaving Benares, passed for a while along the valley of the Ganges. Through the windows of their carriage, the travellers had glimpses of the diversified landscapes of Bihar, with mountains clothed in verdure, in fields of barley, wheat, and corn, its jungles peopled with green alligators, its neat villages, and its thickly leaved forests. Elephants were bathing in the waters of the sacred river, and groups of Indians, despite the advanced season and chilly air, were performing solemnly their pious ablutions. These were fervent Brahmins, the bitterest foes of Buddhism, their deities being Vishnu, the solar god Shiva, the divine impersonation of natural forces, and Brahma, the supreme ruler of priests and legislators. What will these divinities think of India, anglicized as it is today, with steamers whistling and scudding up along the Ganges, frightening the gulls which float upon its surface, the turtles swarming along its banks, and the faithful dwelling upon its borders? The panorama passed before their eyes like a flash, save when the steam concealed it fitfully from the view. The travellers could scarcely discern the fort of Chupeni, 20 miles southward from Benares, the ancient stronghold of the Rajas of Bihar, or Ghazipur and its famous rosewater factories, or the tomb of Lord Cornwallis, rising on the left bank of the Ganges, the fortified town of Buxar or Patna, a large manufacturing and trading place, where it's held the principal opium market of India, or Monghir, a more than European town, for it is as English as Manchester or Birmingham, with its iron foundries, edge tool factories, and high chimneys puffing clouds of black smoke heavenward. Night came on, the train passed at full speed, in the midst of the roaring of the tigers, bears, and wolves which fled before the locomotive, and the marvels of Bengal, Golconda, ruined Gaur, Murshidabad, the ancient capital, Burdwan, Hugli, and the French town of Chandernagore, where Passepartout would have been proud to see his country's flag flying, were hidden from their view in the darkness. Calcutta was reached at 7 in the morning, and the packet left for Hong Kong at noon, so that Phileas Fogg had 5 hours before him. According to his journal, he was due at Calcutta on the 25th of October, and that was the exact date of his actual arrival. He was therefore neither behindhand nor ahead of time. The 2 days gained between London and Bombay had been lost, as has been seen in the journey across India, but it's not to be supposed that Phileas Fogg regretted them. Chapter 15, in which the bag of banknotes disgorges some thousands of pounds more. The train entered the station, and Passepartout, jumping out first, was followed by Mr. Fogg, who assisted his fair companion to descend. Phileas Fogg intended to proceed at once to the Hong Kong steamer, in order to get Aouda comfortably settled for the voyage. He was unwilling to leave her while they were still on dangerous ground. Just as he was leaving the station, a policeman came up to him and said,
"Mr. Phileas Fogg."
"I am he."
"Is this man your servant?"
added the policeman, pointing to Passepartout. "Yes."
Be so good, both of you, as to follow me.
Mr. Fogg betrayed no surprise whatever. The policeman was a representative of the law, and law is sacred to an Englishman. Passepartout tried to reason about the matter, but the policeman tapped him with his stick, and Mr. Fogg made him a signal to obey. "May this young lady go with us?"
She may.
Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout were conducted to a palkigari, a sort of four-wheeled carriage driven by two horses, in which they took their places and were driven away. No one spoke during the 20 minutes which elapsed before they reached their destination. They first passed through the black town, with its narrow streets, miserable dirty huts, and the squalid population, and then through the European town, which presented a relief in its bright brick mansions, shaded by coconut trees and bristling with masts, where, although it was early morning, elegantly dressed horsemen and handsome equipages were passing back and forth. The carriage stopped before a modest-looking house, which, however, did not have the appearance of a private mansion. The policeman, having requested his prisoners, for so truly they might be called, to descend, conducted them into a room with barred windows, and said,
"You will appear before Judge Obadiah at 8:30.
And then he retired and closed the door.
"And why we are prisoners?"
exclaimed Passepartout, falling into a chair. Aouda, with an emotion she tried to conceal, said to Mr. Fogg, "Sir, you must leave me to my fate. It's on my account you receive this treatment. It's for having saved me." Fogg contented himself with saying that it was impossible. It was quite unlikely that he should be arrested for preventing a study. The complainants would not dare present themselves with such a charge. There was some mistake. Moreover, he would not in any event abandon Aouda, but would escort her to Hong Kong.
"But the steamer leaves at noon."
"We shall be on board at noon." It was said so positively that Passepartout couldn't help muttering to himself, "Parbleu, that's certain. Before noon we shall be on board." But he was by no means assured. At 8:30 the door opened. The policeman appeared, and requesting them to follow him, led the way to an adjoining hall. It was evidently a courtroom, and a crowd of Europeans and natives had already occupied the rear of the apartment. Mr. Fogg and his two companions took their places on a bench opposite the desks of the magistrate and his clerk. Immediately after, Judge Obadiah, a fat, round man, followed by his clerk, entered. He proceeded to take down a wig which was hanging on a nail, and put it hurriedly on his head.
"The first case,"
And then, putting his hand to his head, he exclaimed,
"Sir, this is not my wig."
"No, your worship, then it's mine."
"My dear Mr. Oysterpuss, how can a judge give a wise sentence in a clerk's wig?"
And so the wigs were exchanged. Passepartout was getting nervous, for the hands on the face of the big clock over the judge seemed to go around with terrible rapidity.
"The first case."
"Phileas Fogg?" "I'm here." "Passepartout?" "Present."
"Good, you have been looked for prisoners for 2 days on the trains from Bombay."
"Of what are we accused?" asked Passepartout impatiently.
"You're about to be informed."
"I am an English subject, sir, and I have the right—"
"Have we been ill-treated?"
"Not at all."
"Very well, let the complainants come in."
A door was swung open by the order of the judge, and 3 Indian priests entered. "That's it. These are the rogues who were going to burn our young lady," muttered Passepartout. The priests took their places in front of the judge, and the clerk proceeded to read in a loud voice a complaint of sacrilege against Phileas Fogg and his servant, who were accused of having violated a place held consecrated by the Brahmin religion.
"You hear the charge?"
"Yes, sir." "And I admit it."
"You admit it?"
"I admit it, and I wish to hear these priests admit, in their turn, what they were going to do with the pagoda of Pillage." The priests looked at each other, and they didn't seem to understand what was said.
Yes, at the pagoda of Pillage, where they were on the point of burning their victim."
The judge stared with astonishment, and the priests were stupefied.
"What victim? Where whom in Bombay itself?"
"Bombay?"
"Certainly we are not talking of the pagoda of Pillage. Put the pagoda Malabar here at Bombay. And as a proof, here are the desecrator's very shoes which he left behind him.
Whereupon he placed a pair of shoes on the desk.
My shoes,
cried Passepartout in his surprise, permitting this imprudent exclamation to escape him. The confusion of master and man, who had quite forgotten the affair at Bombay, for they were now detained at Calcutta, may be imagined. Fix, the detective, had foreseen the advantage which Passepartout's escapade gave him, and delaying his departure for 12 hours, had consulted the priests of Malabar Hill. Knowing that the English authorities dealt very severely with this kind of misdemeanor, he promised them a goodly sum in damages, and sent them forward to Calcutta by the next train. Owing to the delay caused by the rescue of the young widow, Fix and the priests reached the Indian capital before Mr. Fogg and his servant, the magistrates having already been warned by a dispatch to arrest them should they arrive. Fix's disappointment when he learned that Phileas Fogg had not made his appearance in Calcutta may be imagined as well. He made up his mind that the robber had stopped somewhere on the route and taken refuge in the southern provinces. For 24 hours Fix watched the station with feverish anxiety, and at last he was rewarded by seeing Mr. Fogg and Passepartout arrive, accompanied by a young woman, whose presence he was wholly at a loss to explain. He hastened for a policeman, and this was how the party came to be arrested and brought before Judge Obadiah. Had Passepartout been a little less preoccupied, he would have espied the detective ensconced in a corner of the courtroom, watching the proceedings with an interest easily understood, for the warrant had failed to reach him at Calcutta, as it had done at Bombay and Suez. Judge Obadiah had unfortunately caught Passepartout's rash exclamation, which the poor fellow would given the world to recall.
The facts are admitted.
Admitted?
Inasmuch as the English law protects equally and sternly the religions of the Indian people and the man Passepartout has admitted he violated the sacred order of pagoda of Malabar Hill on Bombay on the 20th of October, I condemn the said Passepartout to imprisonment for 15 days and a fine of £300.
£300? Cried Passepartout, startled at the largeness of the sum.
Silence!
And inasmuch as it is not proved that the act was not done by the connivance of the master with his servant, and as the master in any case must be held responsible for the acts of his paid servant, I condemn Phileas Fogg to a week's imprisonment and a fine of £150. Fix rubbed his hands softly with satisfaction. If Phileas Fogg could be detained in Calcutta a week, it would be more than enough time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout was stupefied. This sentence ruined his master. A wager of £20,000 lost, because he, like a precious fool, had gone into that abominable pagoda. Fogg, as self-composed as if the judgment did not in the least concern him, did not even lift his eyebrows while it was being pronounced. Just as the clerk was calling the next case, he rose and said, "I offer bail." "You have that right." Fix's blood ran cold, but he resumed his composure, for which he heard the judge announce that the bail required for each prisoner would be £1,000. "I will pay it at once," said Mr. Fogg, taking a roll of bank bills from the carpet-bag which Passepartout had by him, and placing them on the clerk's desk. "This sum will be restored to you upon your release from prison. Meanwhile you are liberated on bail." "Come," said Fogg to his servant. "But let them at least give me back my shoes," cried Passepartout angrily. "These are pretty dear shoes," he muttered as they were handed to him. "More than £1,000 apiece. Besides, they pinch my feet." Mr. Fogg, offering his arm to Aouda, then departed, followed by the crestfallen Passepartout. Fix still nursed hopes that the robber would not, after all, leave the £2,000 behind him, but would decide to serve out his week in jail, and issued forth on Mr. Fogg's traces. That gentleman took a carriage, and the party were soon landed on one of the quays. The Rangoon was moored half a mile off in the harbour, its signal of departure hoisted at the masthead. 11 o'clock was striking. Mr. Fogg was an hour in advance of time. Fix saw them leave the carriage and push off in a boat for the steamer, and stamped his feet with disappointment.
The rascal's off after all. 2,000 pounds sacrificed. He's prodigal as a thief. I'll follow him into the other world if it's necessary, but at the rate he's carrying on, the stolen money will be soon exhausted.
The detective wasn't far wrong in making this conjecture. Since leaving London, what with travelling expenses, bribes, the purchase of the elephant, bails, and fines, Mr. Fogg had already spent more than £5,000 on the way, and the percentage of the sum recovered from the bank robber promised to the detectives was rapidly diminishing. Chapter 16, in which Fix does not seem to understand in the least what is said to him. The Rangoon, one of the Peninsular and Oriental Company's boats plying in the Chinese and Japanese seas, was a screw steamer weighing about 1,770 tons and with engines of 400 horsepower. She was as fast, but not as well fitted up as the Mongolia, and Aouda was not as comfortably provided for on board of her as Phileas Fogg could have wished. However, the trip from Calcutta to Hong Kong only comprised some 3,500 miles, occupying from 10 to 12 days, and the young woman was not difficult to please. During the first days of the journey, Aouda became better acquainted with her protector, and constantly gave evidence of her deep gratitude for what he'd done. The phlegmatic gentleman listened to her, apparently at least, with coldness, neither his voice nor his manner betraying the slightest emotion, but he seemed to be always on the watch that nothing should be wanting to Aouda's comfort. He visited her regularly, each day at certain hours, not so much to talk to himself as to sit and hear her talk. He treated her with the strictest politeness, but with the precision of an automaton, the movements of which had been arranged for this purpose. Aouda did not quite know what to make of him, though Passepartout had given her some hint of the master's eccentricity, and made her smile by telling her of the wager which was sending him round the world. After all, she owed Phileas Fogg her life, and she always regarded him through the exalting medium of her gratitude. Aouda confirmed the Parsi Guide's narrative of her touching history. She did indeed belong to the highest of the native races of India. Many of the Parsi merchants have made great fortunes there by dealing in cotton, and one of them, Sir James T. Jejeebhoy, was made a baronet by the English government. Aouda was a relative of this great man, and it was his cousin, Jiji, whom she hoped to join at Hong Kong. Whether she could find a protector in him, she couldn't tell, but Mr. Fogg essayed her to calm her anxieties and to assure her that everything would be mathematically, he used the word, arranged. Aouda fastened her great eyes, clear as the sacred lakes of the Himalaya, upon him, but the intractable Fogg, as reserved as ever, didn't seem at all inclined to throw himself into this lake. The first few days of the voyage passed prosperously, amid favourable weather and propitious winds, and they soon came in sight of the great Andaman, the principal of the islands in the Bay of Bengal, with its picturesque Saddle Peak, 2,400 feet high, looming above the waters. The steamer passed along near the shores, but the savage Papuans, who are in the lowest scale of humanity, but are not, as far as been asserted, cannibals, did not make their appearance. The panorama of the islands, as they steamed by them, was superb. Vast forests of palms, erect bamboo, teakwood, of the gigantic mimosa, and tree-like ferns covered the foreground, while behind, the graceful outlines of the mountains were traced against the sky, and along the coast swarmed by thousands the precious swallows whose nests furnish a luxurious dish to the tables of the celestial empire. The varied landscape afforded by the Andaman Islands was soon passed, however, and the Rangoon rapidly approached the Straits of Malacca, which gave access to the Chinese seas. What was Detective Fix so unluckily drawn on from country to country doing all this while? He had managed to embark on the Rangoon at Calcutta without being seen by Passepartout, after leaving orders that if the warrant should arrive, it should be forwarded to him at Hong Kong, and he hoped to conceal his presence to the end of the voyage. It would have been difficult to explain why he was on board without awaking Passepartout's suspicions, who thought him still at Bombay. But necessity impelled him, nevertheless, to renew his acquaintance with the worthy servant, as will be seen. All the detective's hopes and wishes were now centred on Hong Kong, for the steamer's stay at Singapore would be too brief to enable him to take any steps there. The arrest must be made at Hong Kong, or the robber would probably escape him forever. Hong Kong was the last English ground on which he would set foot. Beyond, China, Japan, America offered to Fogg almost a certain refuge. If the warrant should at least make its appearance at Hong Kong, Fix could arrest him and give him into the hands of the local police. There'd be no further trouble. But beyond Hong Kong, a simple warrant would be of no avail. An extradition warrant would be necessary, and that would result in delays and obstacles, of which the rascal would take advantage to elude justice. Fix thought over these probabilities during the long hours which he spent in his cabin, and kept repeating to himself,
"No, either the warrant will be at Hong Kong, in which case I'll arrest my man, or it'll not be there, and this time it's absolutely necessary I should delay his departure. I've failed at Bombay, and I've failed at Calcutta. If I fail at Hong Kong, my reputation's lost. Cost what it may, I must succeed, but how shall I prevent his departure, if that should turn out to be my last resource?"
Fix made up his mind that if worst came to worst, he would make a confidant of Passepartout and tell him what kind of a fellow his master really was. That Passepartout was not Fogg's accomplice, he was very certain. The servant, enlightened by his disclosure and afraid of being himself implicated in the crime, would doubtless become an ally of the detective. But this method was a dangerous one, only to be employed when everything else had failed. A word from Passepartout to his master would ruin all. The detective was therefore in a sore strait, but suddenly a new idea struck him. The presence of Aouda on the Rangoon, in company with Phileas Fogg, gave him new material for reflection. Who was this woman? What combinations of events had made her Fogg's travelling companion? They had evidently met somewhere between Bombay and Calcutta, but where? Had they met accidentally, or had Fogg gone into the interior purposely in the quest of this charming damsel? Fix was fairly puzzled. He asked himself whether or not there had been a wicked elopement, and the idea so impressed himself upon its mind that he determined to make use of the supposed intrigue. Whether the young woman were married or not, he'd be able to create such difficulties for Mr. Fogg at Hong Kong that he could not escape by paying any amount of money. But could he even wait till they reached Hong Kong? Fogg had an abominable way of jumping from one boat to another, and before anything could be effected, might get full under way again for Yokohama. Fix decided he must warn the English authorities and signal the Rangoon before her arrival. This was easy to do, since the steamer stopped at Singapore, where there is a telegraphic wire to Hong Kong. He finally resolved, moreover, before acting more positively, to question Passepartout. It wouldn't be difficult to make him talk, and as there was no time to lose, Fix prepared to make himself known. It was now the 30th of October, and on the following day the Rangoon was due at Singapore. Fix emerged from his cabin and went on deck. Passepartout was promenading up and down in the forward part of the steamer. The detective rushed forward with every appearance of extreme surprise, and exclaimed, "You here? Wait, no, detective. You here on the Rangoon?" "Oh, Monsieur Fix, you are on board?" returned the really astonished Passepartout, recognizing his crony, the Mongolia. "Why, I left you at Bombay, and here you are on the way to Hong Kong. Are you going around the world too?"
No, I'll stop at Hong Kong, at least for a few days."
Said Passepartout, who seemed for an instant perplexed. "But how is it? I have not seen you on board since we left Calcutta."
"Oh, a trifle of seasickness. I've been staying in my berth. The Gulf of Bengal doesn't agree with me as well as the Indian Ocean. How's Mr. Fogg?"
"As well and as punctual as ever, not a day beyond time. But, Monsieur Fix, you don't know that we have a young lady with us."
"A young lady?"
replied the detective, not seeming to comprehend what was said. Passepartout thereupon recounted out his history, the affair at the Bombay Pagoda, the purchase of the elephant for £2,000, the rescue, the arrest, and the sentence of the Calcutta court, and the restoration of Mr. Fogg and himself to liberty on bail. Fix, who was familiar with the last events, seemed to be equally ignorant of all that Passepartout related, and the latter was charmed to find so interested a listener.
"But how does your master propose to carry this young woman to Europe?"
"Oh, not at all. We are simply hoping to place her under the protection of one of her relatives, a rich merchant at Hong Kong."
Nothing to be done there,"
said Fix to himself, concealing his disappointment.
Would you like a glass of gin, Mr. Passepartout? Willing me, Monsieur Fix. We must at least have a friendly glass on board the Rangoon.
Okay, folks. So, I'm a little out of it tonight, and I don't want to make you all suffer through, a very poor, zone out filled recording. So I'm gonna call it an evening here. If you're new around here, thanks for tuning in. I'm gonna give my YouTube spiel first, because recording and all that. Hi, welcome. This is Paper Cuts. This has been Paper Cuts. I do a lot of things on this YouTube channel. I post quite a few VODs from my Twitch channel on Thursdays and Saturdays. Which, by the way, this recording was actually recorded live via Twitch, and that recording session happens the Friday previous to when this video goes up. So if you want to drop by live for that, that's something you can do. And I do a video on Mondays where I play usually I have a first impression of a game. Right now I'm just playing Super Mario All-Stars. But anyway, that's the channel in a nutshell. Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week for hopefully a more sizable episode of Paper Cuts, because that's what this has been, Paper Cuts. And I hope it didn't sting.
Mm-hmm.